A lonely widower rancher bought a Chinese woman at auction for $3. Next day, town attacked his home, but on the wooden platform, a woman stood alone. Her wrists bore the faint red rings of rope, though she was no longer bound. She had been made to stand there for hours already, a curiosity and a commodity beneath the bleached sky. Her name, though few in the crowd knew it, was Lin May. 23 summers had passed over her, though hardship had carved years deeper into her eyes. She did not bow her head. Her back was straight, and though her dress was plain and the hem frayed, there was a steadiness in the way she placed her bare feet on the worn boards, as though claiming them for herself. The crowd murmured low. Words like foreigner, slave, trouble passed from mouth to mouth with the ease of dust stirred by a boot. A few women looked away, not from pity but from discomfort. A few men smirked, elbowing one another as though the scene were some coarse entertainment. Dixon Crow, foreman of the mine, laughed too loud, his coarse beard shining with sweat. His voice carried above others, brash and sharp as a shovel striking stone. He leaned against the rail with the confidence of a man who thought the town bent to his shadow. At the edge of the crowd, half in the shade of a leaning post, stood Gideon Hale. He wore his hat low, his jaw rough with a few days' growth, his shoulders broad from years of work that began before dawn and ended long after. His boots were dust-choked, his shirt patched at the elbows, but his eyes, gray as river rock, were steady. He did not shift his weight or spit to show belonging. He watched her as one might watch a horse held too long behind a gate, waiting to see if it will bolt or stand when the latch is lifted. The auctioneer rattled on, his voice quick as a sparrow, numbers tossed into the air like seed hoping one might catch. $2. $2.50. Scoffs and mutters. A coin flipped in the sun. Dixon Crow made a joke about cheaper labor down at the camp, drawing ugly laughter from those who drank his words like cheap whiskey. Still, no hands rose. The woman stood, neither trembling nor proud, her gaze turned toward a line of distant hills as though she measured their silence against the crowd's noise. Then Gideon spoke. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the drone of the cicadas, but it carried just enough to still a corner of the crowd. $3. Not a bargain, not a boast, just a plain offering laid down like a stone in water. A hush followed, brief but noticeable. Even the auctioneer paused as if startled by the simplicity of it. Dixon scoffed, spitting into the dirt, but he did not counter. The gavel came down with a tap small as a woodpecker's knock. The deal was done, and murmurs rippled like wind across a wheat field. Gideon stepped forward, his boots sounding against the boards. He did not reach for her arm as others might have. Instead, he untied the rope left dangling at her wrist with careful fingers, not glancing at the crowd. The knot loosened easily. The rope fell, coiling like a shed skin on the floor. He offered her a tin cup of water drawn from a nearby barrel. She took it, her hands shaking only slightly. The water touched her lips, and though it was warm, her eyes softened, as though even that small act tasted like mercy. The crowd shifted, already turning its interest to the next spectacle, already sharpening its tongues for the talk that would fill the saloon by nightfall. Sheriff Amos Kincaid stood near the post, his face unreadable beneath his hat brim. He gave Gideon a nod, neither approval nor disapproval, just acknowledgement that another story had begun under his watch. Gideon lifted his hat in return, a gesture without words, and helped Lin May step down from the platform. She walked beside him without hesitation, her shoulders straight, though her steps carried the weight of many miles unseen. The livery smelled of hay and horse sweat. Gideon prepared his wagon, a sturdy thing worn by years of hauling timber and tools. He laid a folded blanket on the bench seat, not for show but for comfort, and lifted her gently onto it. His touch was firm but not possessive. She looked at him once, her dark eyes unreadable, then fixed her gaze on the road ahead. Gideon climbed beside her, leaving a space wide enough that the blanket between them served as both border and bridge. He clicked the reins, and the horses shifted into motion, hooves striking the packed earth with a rhythm steady as a heartbeat. They rolled out of town beneath the watch of many eyes. Women whispered from shaded porches. Men leaned on fence rails, spitting tobacco juice with the bitter taste of disapproval. Children stared, uncomprehending, before being called back inside. Dixon Crow stood at the saloon door, his grin sharp as broken glass, already shaping the tale he would tell by lamplight. Sheriff Kincaid watched from his horse, saying nothing, though his silence was heavy with choices not yet made. The road stretched long and golden. Dust lifted around the wheels, soft as flour on the wind. Grasshoppers sprang from the verge, clicking into the heat. Gideon said little, his hands sure on the reins, guiding the team with the ease of long habit. Lin May sat quiet, her hands folded in her lap. She glanced at him once, quick as a sparrow's wing, then back to the rolling fields. The air between them was not heavy but unspoken, a space where trust might one day settle if given room. The land unfolded in slow waves, tall grass shimmering like brass, sagebrush scattering gray-green across the hills. A line of cottonwoods marked where a spring bubbled through stone, their leaves whispering like prayer beads. Gideon pointed once with his chin, not breaking silence, and she followed his gesture. A bird wheeled overhead, stitching the sky with its wing beat. She watched it until it vanished into the sun's glare. The hours stretched toward evening. Shadows lengthened, the air softening from brass to honey. Gideon's ranch came into view, a weathered house with a patched roof, a porch that had been mended many times, fence lines kept straight by hard hands. The barn leaned slightly, the wood dark with years, but it stood. The fields bore beans and corn, modest but alive. This was no empire, only a man's honest square of earth. He stopped the wagon at the porch. The horses lowered their heads, blowing dust from their nostrils. Gideon climbed down first, offering his hand not as command but as steadying. She placed her palm in his, her grip light, then stepped down. The boards creaked under their weight. For a moment they stood together, the cicada's song rising again around them, the air thick with the smell of hay and sweat and the faint sweetness of evening clover. Inside, the house bore the marks of a life interrupted. A woman's apron folded neatly on a chair. A shelf of jars lined with careful hands no longer present. A single quilt spread across the bed, its edges frayed but its pattern bright. Gideon opened the front room, set a basin with water, and placed a clean towel beside it. He drew coins from his pocket, 3 silver pieces, and set them on the table. He said no words, but the gesture was clear. She owed him nothing. Her steps were her own. She looked at the coins, then at him, and her lips parted slightly as though she might speak, but no sound came. Instead, she reached to the window and lifted the length of rope he had cut from her wrist. She set it on the sill and left it there, a symbol abandoned to the twilight. The sun slid lower, painting the walls in gold. Outside, the horses settled into their stalls, and the cottonwoods whispered under the breeze. Gideon poured himself coffee, the dark liquid steaming, and offered her a cup of water again. She accepted, sipping slowly. Their eyes met for a moment, and though no words passed, something shifted. It was not yet trust, not yet belonging, but the first stir of soil turned for planting. Night crept in soft. Gideon lit a lantern, its glow pushing back the dark, and placed it on the table. Lin May folded the towel after washing, setting it neatly aside. She stood near the doorway, her figure framed by the square of lamplight, her shadow stretching long across the floorboards. He watched her there, seeing not a stranger bought with coins but a presence that unsettled his long-held silence. Outside, the cicadas hushed, and an owl's call floated across the fields. Gideon leaned back in his chair, the coffee cooling in his hands. Lin May reached to the windowsill and touched the coil of rope one last time before letting her hand fall. The rope remained, useless now, but heavy with memory. Her eyes shifted toward him, as if to say something that could not yet be spoken. His gaze held hers, steady as the stone gray of his eyes, and in that stillness lay a promise of something yet unnamed. And from the road behind, faint in the summer night, came the echo of voices, low, murmuring, carrying the edge of trouble not yet shaped into action. The wind carried them across the fields, wrapping the house in their warning. Inside, the lantern flickered, and both of them stilled, listening, knowing that the quiet they had found might not last the night. Morning came with the sound of doves on the roof and the faint smell of coffee drifting through the house. Light pooled across the floorboards like melted gold, catching the dust motes that turned and shimmered in the still air. Lin May rose before the heat grew strong. She bathed her face in the basin Gideon had set, tying her hair with a strip of blue cloth she had kept tucked in her sleeve since the railroad camp. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, as though each act of washing, folding, arranging was not duty but reclamation. She swept the floor with a willow broom that leaned in the corner, gathering dust into a pan, her bare feet soundless against the wood. Gideon watched from the doorway, the steam of his coffee rising around him, saying nothing. He was a man accustomed to silence, but he noticed the way her presence softened the edges of his home, the way it no longer felt only like a shelter of loss but like a place with breath inside it. She found his late wife's apron folded on a chair, faded from years of wash, and lifted it gently, smoothing the fabric with her hands. For a long moment she studied it, not with envy or intrusion, but with a recognition that homes hold ghosts of their keepers. She folded it tighter and set it in the chest by the wall, treating it as if it were sacred. Gideon's throat tightened. He had never spoken of the woman who had once moved through these rooms, and yet Lin May, without a word, honored her. Later, when Gideon came in from the yard with a pail of water, he found the table set for two. Tin cups side by side, bread sliced on a plate, and in the center, steam rising from a small pot of tea she had brewed with leaves from her own satchel. The scent was foreign, sharp and floral, weaving through the room like memory. She poured a cup for him and set it near his hand without looking directly at him, her gaze fixed instead on the grain of the wood. He lifted it, sniffed, and drank. The taste was unfamiliar but clean, lingering on his tongue like something that asked to be remembered. He did not speak thanks, but the line of his jaw softened, and she noticed, tucking the small moment into her own silence. By mid-morning, Miriam Quinn appeared at the porch, her bonnet shielding her from the glare. She carried a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and a bundle of thread. Her presence was brisk, but her eyes were kind. She glanced at Lin May's wrists and saw the red marks still faint there. Without comment, she drew from her basket a small jar of salve and pressed it into Lin May's hand. Lin May bowed her head slightly, fingers curling around the cool glass. Miriam's voice was steady, practical, speaking of sewing circles and the dryness of the season, but the gift was a message. Some neighbors still remembered mercy. Gideon watched the exchange from the porch rail, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. He knew Miriam had suffered her own share of town whispers when her husband died young, leaving her to fend alone. Perhaps that was why she came now, not for curiosity but for kinship. Lin May carried herself into the rhythm of the ranch. She fed chickens, watered beans in the garden, and gathered eggs into her apron. Gideon caught himself watching from the fence line as she bent to lift a stray chick back into its pen, her expression gentle, her hands sure. She was not loud in her labor. She made no show of virtue. Yet in every movement there was a steadiness that seemed to lay claim to dignity no one could strip. Gideon felt the quiet of his home shifting under her hands, like soil stirred by a careful gardener. Ah Sing came by in the afternoon, carrying a sack of flour from the railroad camp. He placed a small parcel on the porch, wrapped in paper. Inside was dried ginger, and a folded note written in characters Gideon could not read. Lin May's face softened when she saw it. She pressed the packet to her chest before tucking it away in her satchel. Ah Sing gave Gideon a nod, a brief recognition between men who understood the price of keeping a stranger safe. Gideon nodded back, and though no words passed, the message was clear. There were eyes watching, not all of them hostile. But the town's murmur grew with each passing day. Dixon Crow sat in the saloon, spinning tales with the men who leaned on every word. He spoke of cheap labor, of foreign hands stealing bread from honest mouths, of women whispered away in secret. His voice dripped poison into their ears, and though some shifted uncomfortably, few dared to speak against him. Sheriff Amos Kincaid listened too long before he cleared his throat and asked for calm. The lawman was not cruel, but he was tired, and sometimes tiredness bends a man toward silence when words are needed most. Evening chores carried their own rhythm. Gideon and Lin May moved side by side without speaking much. He checked the fences, hammering loose boards back into place, while she drew water from the well and carried it in pails to the trough. When the sun fell low and the cicadas cried louder, she sat by the lantern inside, mending a tear in the sleeve of his shirt. The needle moved in and out, silver glinting in the flame's light. Gideon stood awkward in the doorway, unused to the intimacy of someone tending his clothes. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but the words stayed caught in his chest. Instead he watched, feeling something long dormant stir in the quiet, something more healing than speech. Later, he brought her to the doorway and held out the small brass bell that had hung by the porch for years. Its handle was polished smooth by weather, its sound once used to call children in from the fields. He placed it in her hands, his eyes steady on hers. "If trouble comes, ring once, I will be near." He did not speak it aloud, but she understood. She turned the bell over, tracing its rim with her thumb, and then set it back on the rail. For the first time since arriving, her lips curved faintly, almost a smile, though it passed like a shadow in lamplight. The next morning, Gideon found her at the edge of the field, watching the sun rise over rows of beans. She had tied her hair back, her face calm, her figure outlined in the pale gold light. He stood a few steps behind, not wishing to disturb her. In that moment he realized she was not merely a presence in his house, but a force that altered the shape of his solitude. She did not ask to belong, but she did not drift like a stranger either. She had rooted herself in silence, and somehow that silence had begun to change him. Days unfolded into a pattern both fragile and strong. She learned the creak of the barn door, the pitch of his footsteps across the porch, the way he stirred sugar into coffee without looking. He noticed the way she hummed softly when she worked, tunes foreign but soothing, the way she lifted her chin slightly when facing down the eyes of neighbors on the road. They did not speak much, but between them lay a growing understanding that words could not build. Yet outside the ranch, the whispers hardened. Dixon Crow's stories spread, growing teeth and claws. Men muttered in the general store, women shifted their baskets on the church steps. Even children repeated fragments of rumors, not knowing their weight. Sheriff Kincaid passed Gideon on the road one afternoon, his horse sweating under the sun. He tipped his hat but looked uneasy, as though torn between keeping order and keeping peace. Gideon returned the nod, his jaw tightening. He had lived long enough to know how quickly whispers turn into storms. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Lin May stitched a square of cloth Miriam had brought. The fabric was soft blue, patterned with small white blossoms. She sewed it carefully into a larger quilt Miriam had started, the pieces forming a garden path design. Gideon sat nearby, oiling a saddle, listening to the faint scrape of needle through cloth. He realized that in her stitching she was laying claim to something no gossip could undo. A home was not defended only with rifles or fences. Sometimes it was guarded with quiet persistence, with hands that made beauty from scraps. He felt an ache in his chest, both sorrow for the life he had lost and wonder at the one forming before him. When she finished the square, she held it up, eyes meeting his. For a heartbeat, silence stretched like a bridge. He wanted to tell her that her presence was more than he had expected, more than he knew how to carry. But before he could speak, a sound drifted on the evening air. Hooves. Many of them. Slow, deliberate, not in haste but in gathering. Gideon set the saddle aside, his body stiffening. Lin May's hands lowered the quilt square to her lap, her fingers tightening around the needle. The sound grew clearer, voices carried faintly with it. Gideon rose and stepped onto the porch, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon where dust lifted in the last light of day. The bell still sat on the rail where she had placed it, its handle catching the glow of sunset. Neither of them touched it, but both felt its presence heavy as a heartbeat. Somewhere down the road, Dixon Crow's voice rose among the others, loud and commanding, shaping the murmurs into threat. Gideon stood tall on the porch, shoulders squared, watching as the figures drew closer. Behind him, Lin May gathered the quilt square in her hands, holding it tight against her chest as if bracing for whatever storm was about to break. Sunday drifted in soft, with stillness pressed over the fields like a quilt. The air held the hush of rest, though cicadas droned from the cottonwoods and the faint toll of the church bell in town floated faint across the valley. Gideon Hale sat on the porch steps, the morning sun warming his shoulders, a tin of saddle oil open beside him. He rubbed the leather with slow strokes, his broad hands steady, the faint scent of oil mixing with summer heat. Behind him the screen door creaked, and Lin May stepped out carrying a bowl of peas. She sat on the step above him, her skirt brushing lightly against his shoulder as she began to shell, the rhythm of pods snapping and peas striking wood falling into time with his own work. They said nothing, yet the air between them was companionable, a silence not of strangers but of two people beginning to know one another's breathing. She noticed a scrape across his forearm, raw from where barbed wire had caught him. Setting the bowl aside, she reached for his arm. He tensed, unused to such nearness, but did not pull back. Her fingers were cool, gentle, as she examined the wound. She fetched a cloth and water, cleaning it with the care of someone who had practiced tenderness in places where it was rarely returned. He watched her concentrate, her brow furrowed, her lips pressed lightly together. Her touch was not hesitant but purposeful, as though in that moment his pain mattered more than her own guardedness. He felt the strange quiet of being cared for, something he had not felt in years, and it unsettled him, loosening the stone he had carried in his chest since his wife's passing. When she finished, she sat back with her hands folded neatly in her lap. He turned his arm slowly, testing the movement. The pain was dulled, though that was not what stayed with him. It was the echo of her touch, lingering like a warmth against the skin. He wanted to thank her but found the words clumsy, heavy in his throat. Instead, he picked up the saddle again, resuming the slow rhythm of oiling, trusting that she understood what his silence meant. Later that day, as shadows stretched across the porch, she began to speak. Her voice was quiet, her words halting but deliberate. She told him of a ship that had carried her across an endless sea, of work camps and railroad tracks laid under a punishing sun, of promises spoken by men who vanished like smoke. She named no enemies, no villains, only the wind and the long nights. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon as she spoke, and he listened without interruption, his hat resting in his lap, his face drawn but intent. When her voice faded, the silence that followed was not heavy but full, like a field waiting for rain. He nodded once, a gesture that told her she had been heard, and she lowered her gaze with a small exhale, relief softening her shoulders. That evening he showed her the skillet that had belonged to his wife, its surface blackened from years of use. He set it on the stove with care, his hand lingering on the handle. It had been too heavy to lift since the day she passed, yet now he found himself placing it back where it belonged, as though it might serve again. Lin May touched the pan lightly, not claiming it, not replacing the memory of the woman who had held it before, but acknowledging it with reverence. Gideon watched her, and for the first time the ache in his chest eased, not gone, but changed, as though grief could learn to share space with something new. When Miriam Quinn returned with fabric scraps for quilting, Lin May welcomed her at the table. Together they spread pieces across the wood, arranging colors and patterns into the shape of a garden path. The two women worked in quiet harmony, the sound of scissors cutting cloth, the scrape of needle through fabric filling the kitchen. Gideon stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching them with a stillness he did not wish to disturb. He realized that in the presence of these women, his house was no longer a place of waiting for loss, but of building something again, piece by piece, stitch by stitch. That night, as the sun sank and the crickets began their song, Gideon placed a small purse on the table. Inside were coins, not many, but enough. Alongside it, a folded map to the spring beyond the cottonwoods, and the house key on a leather thong. He did not speak, but in the offering was a question, choice. She studied the items, her hand hovering above them, then reached into her hair and drew out the blue ribbon. She laid it gently on the table between them. It was not surrender but anchor, a sign that she remained not from debt but decision. His eyes lifted to hers, and in that unspoken exchange, something shifted. It was not love declared, but it was trust, delicate, fragile, real. The following day, a boy appeared at the gate. Noah Pike, 8 years old, his knees scraped raw and bleeding from a fall in the lane. Gideon started forward, but Lin May reached him first. She knelt, her skirt gathering dust, and cleaned the wound with water, humming a tune under her breath. The boy watched her with wide eyes, the pain eased not by salve alone but by the gentleness of her care. When she gave him a biscuit from the shelf, he grinned, limping away lighter than he had come. Gideon saw the scene unfold and felt a weight lift from his chest. In her care for the boy, he glimpsed what she carried within herself, a capacity for mercy that could root even in barren ground. He thought of the townsfolk's whispers and knew they had never seen her as he had in that moment. The sky grew heavy with clouds that evening, thunder rolling far off though no rain fell. Gideon sat on the porch with his rifle leaning against the wall, though it remained untouched. Lin May sat beside him, the lantern casting a glow across her face. She was sewing again, the needle glinting in rhythm with the fireflies beyond. He studied her in the porchlight, the soft curve of her expression, the quiet determination in her eyes. She did not speak, but he felt a promise forming between them, as tangible as the bell still perched on the rail. A life built not on debt or rescue, but on shared endurance, on the small daily acts of care that stitched two strangers into something more. But even in that peace, the world pressed close. From the road came the faint sound of hooves, distant but steady, and the murmur of voices carried by the wind. Gideon rose, his body taut with the memory of Dixon Crow's threats. Lynn May set her sewing aside, her fingers lingering on the fabric, then on the bell. She did not ring it, but her hand rested there, as though waiting. Gideon stepped off the porch, scanning the horizon. Lanterns glowed faint in the distance, too many to be neighbors, their light swaying like restless fireflies. Sheriff Kincaid's horse moved slow along the lane, the lawman's silhouette caught in the wavering light, watching, waiting, uncertain. Gideon's breath tightened. He turned back toward the porch where Lynn May stood, framed by the lantern's glow, her face calm but her eyes alert. She held the bell in her hand now, the blue ribbon tied to its handle fluttering lightly in the summer breeze. In the silence that stretched, the choice lay before them both, to yield to the pressure gathering on the road, or to stand together, trusting that dignity was stronger than fear. The cicadas fell quiet, as though the night itself waited for the sound of that bell. The sun climbed high, heavy and merciless, pressing its heat into every board of the porch, every stalk in the garden, every stone in the road that led toward Gideon's ranch. Noon lay thick, without a breeze, and the horizon shimmered as though the earth itself trembled. From that wavering distance rose dust, columns stirred by hooves and boots. Men were coming, voices carried faintly even before their shapes grew clear, their anger moving like a storm across the golden fields. Gideon stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, his shoulders broad against the glare. He carried no rifle, though one leaned inside the door. Instead his hands hung steady at his sides, palms roughened by labor, open. His stillness was unexpected, a wall the men had not counted on. Behind him, the bell rested on the rail where Lynn May had tied the ribbon. Its small brass frame caught the light, glinting like a spark before fire. She stood in the doorway, her face calm but intent, her fingers tracing the ribbon as though steadying herself through it. The riders slowed as they reached the yard. Dixon Crow was at their head, his horse snorting, hooves striking dust that curled into the air. His shirt clung to his chest, his face red with sun and drink, his grin as sharp as broken glass. Men clustered behind him, some from the mine, some from town, their eyes shifting with the unease of those who follow more out of fear than conviction. Sheriff Kincaid lingered at the edge, his horse moving slow, the lines of his face deep with conflict. He had come, but he had not chosen where to stand. Dixon's voice cut the silence. He spoke of law, of foreign hands that did not belong, of the insult to their town that one of their own would bring a woman from across the sea into his home. He called her a threat, a thief of bread, a shadow against their way of life. His words dripped venom, filling the air until even the crickets fell quiet. The men shifted, murmuring, their eyes darting toward Gideon, waiting for him to break or bow. But Gideon did not speak. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on Dixon with the steadiness of stone. The silence was heavier than words, pressing back against the noise. Dixon's grin faltered for a heartbeat, unsettled by a man who would not play his script. He spat into the dust, lifting his hand as if to gesture for the men to advance. The air thickened. Horses stamped, restless, sensing the charge of anger. Lynn May stepped forward then, her skirt brushing the doorframe. She lifted the bell and set it on the porch rail, where all could see. The blue ribbon fluttered in the heat. Without hurry, she walked to the well. Each step was deliberate, her posture straight, her chin lifted. The men watched, uneasy, as she tied the rope to the bucket, lowering it with a steady arm. The rope groaned as it slid, the bucket striking water below with a hollow splash. She drew it up, the muscles in her arms taut, her hair slipping loose from its knot. The water sloshed, spilling over her hands, but she carried it across the yard as though she bore more than water. She bore the right to stand in daylight, not hidden. Dixon sneered, his laughter forced. He called her shameless, flaunting herself, daring to act as though she belonged. Yet his voice wavered, a crack beneath the mockery. The men behind him muttered, but some shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering in the face of a woman's simple dignity. Then, like tinder catching flame, trouble sparked. Young Noah Pike had slipped into the crowd again, curious beyond caution. He tripped near a man's boot, stumbling against a lantern that hung loose on a saddle. The glass cracked as it fell, spilling flame into the dry grass at the edge of the yard. In an instant the fire licked upward, hungry, seizing the brittle stems, smoke curling black against the noon sun. Horses reared, men cursed, stumbling back from the sudden blaze. Lin May did not hesitate. She hitched her skirt and ran, the bucket swinging in her hands. She dashed the water across the flames, the hiss loud as a serpent. Gideon moved beside her, hauling a keg from the porch, dousing what remained. Together they fought the fire, boots blackened, hands red from rope and heat. Steam rose, curling around them like smoke from incense, and in that shared motion the threat was undone. Silence fell again, but this time it was heavier, deeper. Dixon's words had burned away in the steam. He sat on his horse, jaw tight, eyes darting as the men behind him stared. Not at Gideon, not at him, but at Lin May, standing with her skirt singed and her hands raw, breathing hard but upright. In her defiance was no arrogance, only the simple insistence of her humanity. Gideon lifted the scorched lantern from the ground, setting it upright on the rail. He looked at Sheriff Kincaid, not pleading, not demanding, simply steady, his gaze carrying the truth plain as daylight. This house harmed no one. The sheriff breathed heavy, his chest rising and falling as though he wrestled with himself. At last he straightened in his saddle, voice carrying over the men. "Go home," he said. The law had no quarrel with Gideon, nor with the woman he had chosen to shelter. Murmurs rippled. Some cursed, some shifted in frustration, but the spark of violence had died with the flame. Dixon spat again, his fury brittle. He barked that this was not the end, that the town would not forget. Yet his words lacked teeth now. One by one, the men turned their horses, retreating, dust rising behind them as quickly as it had come. Dixon lingered, glaring, but when no one followed, he jerked his reins and rode off, his shadow shrinking in the sun. Sheriff Kincaid remained a moment longer. His gaze met Gideon's, then Lin May's. There was apology in it, weary and quiet, though no words were spoken. He tipped his hat and rode on, leaving the ranch in a stillness deeper than before. On the porch, Miriam Quinn appeared from the cottonwoods, carrying a basket, her hymn humming low. She had watched, bearing witness, ready if the storm had broken worse. She set the basket on the rail, her eyes on Lin May with a respect that did not need speaking. Parson Whitlow passed by on his mule, thin as a post, nodding toward them with solemn recognition. From the road, Ah Sing approached, leaving a small tin of jasmine pearls on the step, his face unreadable but his gesture clear. Gideon and Lin May stood side by side, their hands blackened, their chests still heaving. The noon sun glared down, yet the weight had lifted. The storm had come and passed, and though it left scars, it also left something firmer than before. Gideon picked up the bell from the rail, its ribbon dampened by steam, and handed it back to her. She tied the ribbon tighter, securing it to the handle, her fingers firm. The bell gleamed, no longer just a warning, but a symbol of endurance, of a house that had stood when men sought to bring it low. For a moment they said nothing, watching the dust fade on the horizon. The cicadas resumed their song, tentative at first, then full. The land shimmered again in the heat, but it felt changed, as though it had borne witness to a promise sealed not with vows but with action. Gideon looked at Lin May, her hair loose around her face, her eyes shining with exhaustion and fire. He thought of the rope she had placed on the windowsill days before, shed like old skin. He thought of the ribbon she had laid on the table, the anchor of her choice. Now she stood with the bell in her hands, the ribbon fluttering, her dignity undeniable. The house smelled faintly of smoke, the boards damp, but it was still standing. And in its heart stood two people who had refused to bend. Gideon felt something rise in his chest, steady and sure, like the first stirrings of rain after a long drought. Lin May turned to him, and though no words passed, her look was clear. They had chosen to stand, and they would stand still. But far beyond, where the town's roofs shimmered in the distance, voices would not rest. Dixon's anger was not gone, only scattered, waiting for some darker hour. The sheriff's choice had bought peace, but peace in such places was fragile as glass. Gideon knew it. Lin May knew it. And so the bell, tied with its ribbon, did not rest as ornament but as sentinel, a promise that when the storm returned, as storms always did, it would be met not with silence, but with a clear, ringing note of courage.